Hey everybody, it's UIO, the new podcast for teenage girls, bringing you a special episode on sex. Hugs to everyone, and thank you for listening to UIO, the podcast for teenage girls. It is for you and about you inside out. I am Sonja Lewis, your host. Today in this special episode of UIO, we're talking about sex. A complex subject to talk about, controversial too. It is a loaded topic for any age group, and for teenage girls it can be a minefield. That's why it's important to talk about it, no matter how uncomfortable it might feel. There's so much misinformation out there which glamorizes sex and some way somehow suggests it as a norm that teenage dating is incomplete without it. This train of thought often outweighs deeply seated values, physical and mental health risks, and long-term life ramifications. Today, I want to challenge this way of thinking, not because I'm old-fashioned or sanctimonious, but because I am realistically concerned about the impact that premature sex is having on each and every girl, on families, on society. In the interest of happier, healthier teenage years and a good transitioning into adulthood, let's talk. To help us with this complex conversation is the fabulous Rachel Gardner, founder of the Romance Academy, a project which got its start in 2005 as a 3-part BBC documentary called No Sex Please, We're Teenagers. All these years later, the Academy is still going strong, and Rachel will tell us about it, no doubt. But first, we're going to get her take on the topic at hand. Welcome, Rachel. You know, admittedly, sex is a subject that I didn't talk to my mom about and still don't find it easy to talk about with elders. And I am a grown woman. And I'm not sure if this has to do with my Christian background or if it's just an embarrassing topic altogether. And since I've been doing this podcast, and especially thinking of this one on sex, it reminds me of soul singer Betty Wright's song, Tonight is the Night, where she is singing about a young girl making love for the very first time. Ooh. And in introducing it to her mom, she teased that her mom said, I know you're not going to sing that song. And if my mom were alive, I think she just might say something similar, but as Betty used it by her mother, I'm going to imagine that my mom is smiling down from heaven. I'm just so grateful that you're here today to talk with me about this. And I think perhaps the concern with my mother's generation, and even some now, is that the belief is that inside information allures and attracts. But over the years, I've learned that inside information, handled carefully, informs and teaches and helps with healthier decision making and can be the difference in healthy and unhealthy decisions. And as said earlier, so much misinformation is out there. Regardless of faith background, I think girls have some information, whether we give it to them or not, likely misguided. And it feels only right that they get the best possible tools, if you will, that they can have for making the best possible life experiences. So, Rachel, I'm just, again, thank you so much. And what you're doing to inform teenage girls or teenagers in general on this topic of sex is great. And I'd love for you to tell us about why you started the Romance Academy and tell us about its aims.
Thanks, Sonja. It's great to be with you. I love what you do. I love your heart. And I think we share a heart, Sonja. My heart is that young people feel inspired by the relationships they see around them. And they not only have accurate information that they can depend on and make good choices about, but they also have wisdom about what is it that makes healthy relationships and why a relationship's important. So, yeah, I'm totally the same as you. Information is power, and we want our young people to feel empowered in their self-worth and empowered in their choices.
I think that's wonderful, and I want to pick up on building relationships. Let's talk about dating and how important it is during the teen years. It's natural to date. I think sometimes people think, oh my goodness, it's scary. I don't want my child to date, because all of these things begin to come up. They begin to become introduced to things that we wouldn't necessarily want them to prematurely get into. But how can teen girls enjoy this experience? of dating without being lured into premature sex?
One of the key things, I think, is reminding the younger generations that dating isn't an end goal. It is a process. It's a journey. It's one of the relationships, and it's one of the ways in our life that we find out more about ourselves. So I think for many young women, and this was definitely my story, I entered the dating world in a really passive attitude. So I kind of thought dating is just this thing you have to do, but I had no idea what dating was. Like, what do you do and what do you talk about? And what do you do if he suggests something that you're not comfortable with? And I think particularly in the Christian community, I grew up thinking, well, if he's a Christian and he suggests something, then he must know what he's talking about and it must be right. So I think we want to empower girls and guys to see that dating is not an end goal. It's one of the ways that we sharpen our relational tools and we learn loads about ourselves, because one day, if you're going to get married, you're not going to be perfectly brilliant at relationships. Dating is one of those processes that helps you learn how to be a selfless partner, a selfless wife, a selfless husband. And I think that can really empower girls to see that thinking for themselves and learning to make decisions and standing by them now is laying the great foundation for them to be powerful women of the future, mothers, wives, business women, whatever it is they're going to do.
That is absolutely brilliant, because I've never thought of it that way, and here I am, my age, and I think that makes that makes a lot of sense. That it's a part of the process. It's not an end, and I think that's oftentimes what you think. It's the teenage years, and I'm going to be dating, and people don't know how to do that.
And I think if you look at like social media and how particularly young people use social media, dating is a status. Like, I'm now with somebody, and it kind of says, I'm okay, I'm worth loving, I'm worth loved. And I think we want to sort of encourage girls to see dating as a really positive thing, but it's not the way that you demonstrate that you are worthy of love. It's not a status, like a label. Actually, dating is hard work, and it takes hard work. And I think that's really important that we help girls look beyond just dating as a way to find their self-worth.
I think that's absolutely right. And so they're learning a lot about themselves, but why should they not have sex?
Well, sex is a brilliant gift. It's a way to the deepest kind of intimacy, I think, that we're created for. But it's not something that you should rush into, because I think what often I see with the girls that I work with is that they are really hungry for a deep and meaningful connection with another human being. But sometimes sex can actually be a barrier to that deep and meaningful communication, which feels ironic, doesn't it? The thing that everything in media and culture says is the ultimate connection, and everything in religion is also, it's a gift from God, but used wrongly, too early, premature, like you say, actually can be a barrier to the intimacy and can actually breed within particularly young females and young males this deep sense of isolation, of insecurity, of fear, of not measuring up. And so I think delaying sexual activity for a committed relationship, for marriage, for the future, is one of the ways of vouchsafing that your sexual experience is really rich and meaningful. So again, it's helping young people who live in the moment, and that's why we love them, but it's helping them look a little bit further ahead. And say, just plan, have some plans in your mind. Sex is brilliant and it's beautiful, but premature, it can actually leave you in a place that you don't want to end up in.
I think that's fantastic, and it brings up the emotional aspects of it. I'm getting ahead of myself because I do want to talk about the practical implications, which we talk about all the time. There's sex education in different environments, and we talk about the practical implications or consequences of having premature sex. But what we don't talk about as much are the emotional consequences.
Absolutely.
And you really hit upon that. And I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about it, because I think that's the key. I think that's what's missing. Because it's pretty clear that people understand the risks of teen pregnancy. They understand the risk of STIs. This desire to have this deeper connection, somehow, it just sort of outweighs even their deep morals and values sometimes, and they rush into these relationships. But I do think sometimes if we consider the fears and some of the other emotional aspects that we get into, we might reconsider a bit, and I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think the emotional world is really important to talk about. I think we're getting a little bit better at talking about emotions, but you're absolutely right. Like, we can make decisions that reduce the risk of teen pregnancy, that reduce the risk of sexually transmitted infections. So what are the decisions that reduce the risk of emotional distress? We don't talk about that enough. And the way that we reduce the risk of emotional distress is that we help build young women's sense of self-worth, their core value, their core beliefs. Because what sometimes happens is a young person's immense desire to be okay, to be enough, to be loved, to be valued, in a culture that says that has to be about sex, then you have sex, but you still feel that this is not a meaningful relationship. You still feel not valued. You still feel not loved. And the guy that you gave yourself to is now going to have sex with somebody else. Well, where does that leave you? That leaves you questioning everything about who you are. And so actually saying to young men and young women, actually protect your heart, protect your emotional well-being, soul care, self-care is part and parcel of becoming the adult that you are. And so we live in a culture that sees having sex as a rite of passage. What if we lived in a culture, Sonja, that actually saw delaying sexual activity, just holding yourself back from that beautiful thing for now, is actually the mark of maturity, the mark of adulthood? Like, anyone can have sex, but it takes somebody powerful, courageous, wise, brave, daring to say, I'm just going to stop. I'm just going to take a look at this. I'm going to decide for myself because I want it to be great. And I know that actually I have a lot of responsibility and a lot of choices that I can make. So I think we need to change the script a bit, I think, about sex and relationships. Let's change that script and talk more positively about how you could have really great sex one day. Would actually involve probably saying no now.
I mean, that's really powerful. That's fantastic. That leads us to, let's say somebody's already been having sex. And it leads to the point of it's really never too late to reconsider, because we are going to find ourselves talking to an audience where some people are already engaging in sex.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to make the point that I don't want to ostracize, I don't want to isolate, I want to reach out to every teenage girl. So what advice do you have for young ladies who are already engaged in having sex?
What I want to say is that you are so beautiful and you have incredible potential and you have every right to make the choices for yourself that you want to make. I think the irony, Sonja, of as you're talking about that very sexualized culture is the double standards that we see in cultures. On the one hand, girls feel they need to be sexually experienced, they need to be good at what they do. But on the other hand, we're in a culture where if they start having sex, they're called a slut, they're called a slag, and it's this double standard. So I think you're absolutely right. We need to be saying that if you've already started having sexual intimacy, if you're already being sexually active, that doesn't make you anything other than you. You're still you. And there will be some girls listening to this saying, actually, I'm quite comfortable being sexually active. I've made these choices and I feel good with that. There'll be other girls listening saying, yeah, I had sex and now I can see I actually had it for the wrong reasons and I'm kind of not sure what to do with that now. And our message, isn't it, that you are of infinite worth, you have incredible potential and you have every right to think for yourself and to review what's happening in your life and make decisions that bring life. And to talk to people, reach out to people who you think will help you really see who you are and the way that you want to be living and will support you if you choose, actually, I've had sex, but I want to wait now until I'm ready or until a different relationship or until I'm married. That's so important. And I think you're so right, Sonja. As women, we often internalize a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, and that shame can often silence us and stop us knowing that we have the right and the capacity to make brilliant choices for ourselves every day. So I think you're absolutely right. This is not about some girls that are in the no sex club and some girls are outside the club. We're all in the same club and we're all kind of living this one crazy, wild, incredible life. And sometimes we learn the hard way. And sometimes that means we're a bit more wise because we've learned the hard way. Well, let's take that opportunity and be the wise women that we are.
Yeah, I think that's so key. And I do, before we leave this subject to talk about other related subjects, because it's all really, sexually related, I just want to talk about some of the risks, involved and engaging, and not just the physical risk, but again, you have pointed them out, but I want to reiterate some of the emotional and mental risk as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There is evidence to say that the earlier people start being sexually active, the more sexual partners they will go on to have. And we know that the more sexual partners women have, the greater the chance that those relationships won't last very long. And again, we're not using this to kind of beat people over the head or to say, oh, if you had sex young, you are automatically going to be X, Y, and Z. But I think you're absolutely right. Being informed by the information means that we can make good choices. We are created for relationship, and we are created for faithful relationship. So when we engage in sexual activity and relationship, there's an erosion of our self-respect. There's an erosion of our capacity to make choices. Actually, what happens is we begin to doubt that we are worth love. And we begin to doubt that we are worthy of love. And we maybe even will begin to seek out relationships with people who won't respect us and won't care for us because we don't feel that we deserve anything better. And I think probably so many of us know that, not just in our heads, but we know that in our own experience. We've been in relationships that we know that person is not loving us. They say they love us, but they're not demonstrating it. And I think it takes a very brave girl, a very brave woman to say, wait a minute, I think I'm worth more, not because actually, I'm the best woman in the world. It's not about having an inflated ego, but it's about saying I have infinite worth and value. And if I'm with somebody whose treatment of me is eroding my sense of self-esteem and self-worth, I've got to get out of here. And so I think I do see that women in my life, that my friends, the girls I work with, those that have learnt the hard way that actually you've got to be wise in relationships.
Yes.
And you've got to say no, and you've got to step back, and you've got to protect yourself. I think those are the women that have gone on to have relationships where they are quicker to go and build the good stuff into their relationships.
Why is it so important for adult education too, and for these young people to be able to talk to the adults in their lives? Because I'm learning so much right now just talking to you. I'm amazed, thinking, well, what are we going to do to promulgate this? Because it's a message that needs to be heard. It really needs to be heard. So what is there? What can we do to sort of get this information out there to make sure that more young women are able to understand this?
Well, I think you're role modelling it, Sonja. I think you've taken to the airways and you've taken to social media and you're saying, let's have these national conversations. I think the more that we can amplify and elevate a national conversation about what really is going on in relationships, the better. I think we get on Facebook, we get on Instagram, and we see people's perfect relationships out there, and we don't realise that every relationship has a backstage. Every relationship has difficult times. So I think the more that religious leaders, community leaders, film scripts, musicians, artists, families can talk about what's really happening, the more I think it can kind of reassure young women particularly that actually there's not this perfect ideal they need to attain to. There's actually just the wonder of making a relationship work in the here and now and making those little decisions in the here and now that empower us. So I think more of you and more women sharing their story and sharing their wisdom, that's the difference. Information sometimes doesn't get through, but wisdom really communicates. That penetrates the heart, and that changes lives. Stories changes lives.
I think that's really key. And I would just add to that, at your mention of social media and that type of thing, that it's so key to speak to young people in their language. And that's something that I'm learning and beginning to learn, something that they can relate to, because sometimes if the medium isn't correct, it won't get across. So I think that's really key. So we'll keep drumming on. Thank you so much for that. Let's move on to other related topics. I want to talk about gender identity and what it means. I have run across a couple of articles that got my attention about girls not wanting to be identified as girls, which may or may not have to do with sexual orientation. And I've actually mentioned this in a couple of podcast interviews that I've done. I mentioned it. And I think that sometimes there's a lot of confusion when, as girls begin to take on more traditionally male roles. There's this thing about masculinity that comes in. And I don't know if it's because they feel that they have to be more masculine to have more equity. I don't know what it is, but it really, really sort of got my attention. One article in particular suggested that girls didn't want to be girls anymore. They didn't want to be called girls. They'd like to be referred to as they. And I didn't feel very happy about that. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about gender identity and what it has to do with being feminine. And how can girls take on non-traditional roles and still identify as girls?
Yeah, I think gender really matters, and I'm not somebody who wants to see an erosion of gender, but I do think that the hatred and the violence against girls and women worldwide is reaching epidemic levels. And I think we have a generation of young women and teenage girls growing up, and they are looking across the world, and they are aware of rape culture. They're aware of the insidiousness of pornography, where women are just sex objects that are just used. They're aware of the sex robots. They're aware of the way rape is used as a weapon of war. They're aware of all this stuff. And they also look in the Western culture and they see that still pink is girl and blue is boy, and there are such oppressive, narrow stereotypes. And I think often what I see in the young people I work with when they are rejecting gender is actually, I think what they're often rejecting is the oppression of gender. And I think sometimes what we refer to as gender is actually personality. Yes. So sometimes we say female is nurturing, quiet, passive, gentle, creative. Male is strong, powerful, incisive, directive. That's personality, I would say. That's not gender. I think what I tend to talk about is a gender critical narrative. How can we make sure that we speak against the negative, narrow, oppressive channels, and we free people up to be the brilliant individual, the male, the female that God created them to be? So my question to a teenage girl is not, how are you coping with being a teenage girl? My question to her is, how are you being you? You know, how are you living your one world life? Where are the ceilings in your life that you need to bust through? And your way of being female is absolutely brilliant. And if it looks like wearing tracksuits, do sport, traditional male stuff, then you bust that. You know, that is brilliant. That is you being fully female, fully you. So I think I would like the church and youth workers to be maybe more engaged with a gender critical approach that says to young people, don't label yourself. Free yourself up. And it's not about dissolving gender. It's about removing the oppressive, narrow views of what gender enables you to do. There's a big national conversation, and young people who are experiencing transgender are some of the most discriminated against in culture, so we need to be so mindful of caring for young people who are questioning their gender. But I think nationally, let's do all that we can to remove these oppressions from our young people and free them up to be them.
I think that's fantastic, because I think that it can be so misunderstood from the perspective of just sort of looking at it on the surface, but you've explained it and made it very clear, and it really is about freeing people from the oppression, because there is so much that's oppressive these days, sadly, about being a girl and a woman, and that's what we're trying to turn around.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. And it is a good segue to sexual orientation, which is a very tricky subject. Mm-hmm. And I think often gender identity can be confused with sexual orientation. And when I was a girl, I was a serious tomboy. I know a lot of people find that hard to believe, but my father and I were joking just the other day about me riding a dirt bike better than any boy in town. And I could run. I was a fast runner too. But as I got older, that sort of thing kind of fell away. Other things took on, and I didn't do those things anymore. And so probably people in high school would say, what is she talking about? I don't remember her running. But people who knew me in middle school and as a younger girl knew that I could do those things and, all of those things. But it had nothing to do with my sexuality. And this goes to this website, Teen Help, says that sexual orientation is determined by a variety of genetic, environmental, and emotional factors, but not by teens' parents or activity. I think this probably is still a debate, particularly in faith-based communities. We heard it a lot during certain elections and that kind of thing. But whatever we believe, as we live in such a highly sex culture, teens do begin to grapple with sexuality issues much earlier. But this website, Teen Help, also says being curious or having thoughts about members of the same sex is common among teens and does not always mean that a teen is homosexual. And strong feelings of friendship are normal during this time and do not necessarily indicate a person's sexuality. What I want to ask you about is whether you have any advice for teen girls who are confused about their sexual orientation. What more can they do, particularly if they're from a traditional background where building a non-sexual, relationship, as you said, with a member of the same sex is not consistent with beliefs, values?
It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And I think it feels like a profoundly complicated situation, and for many people in religious communities, it is a big conversation, and churches are dividing over it, families are dividing over it. But if we want to make the young person central in this, I think remembering that actually questioning anything about your identity when you're a teenager, whether it's am I good at sports, who am I attracted to, am I pretty, am I clever, those questions are so enormous and can lead to young people feeling a great sense of despair if they feel they're not accepted and loved. So I think the first message is to say, okay, if you are questioning your sexual orientation, don't be hard on yourself, particularly if you come from a traditional background where you feel you won't be accepted if you come out as gay or bisexual. Remind yourself that you are worthy of love and you are lovable, and try as much as possible to surround yourself with friends and adults in your community who really care about you, who really believe in you, and are going to help you walk this journey. As you say, for some young people, questioning their sexual orientation is simply a part of the process of developing their heterosexuality. For other young people, it might be that actually they're going to be travelling down the route of, as an adult, identifying as gay. Either way, as a Christian community, our role is not to impose our judgment on them, but to love these young people so that they have the opportunity, if they are Christian young people, to bring that to God, to allow him to speak into that, and to know that whatever happens, they are utterly worthy of love. They are utterly accepted to Jesus. And I think so many young people from traditional backgrounds are terrified that if they start down this line, it will end up with isolation and rejection. That can lead some of our young people to very poor mental health and making decisions that hurt themselves. So I think my dedication to young people is that whatever the conversation, the church is happening about this conversation, let's not make our young people the guinea pig around this. Let's protect them. Let's give them the opportunity, like with all young people, to say, delay sexual activity. Don't jump into stuff. Just wait to find out who you are. Find out what your skills and your strengths and your visions and your dreams for life is. And then in the midst of that, find people that are going to love you and help you just ask these questions that feel terrifying, but actually you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And I think that's a really important message.
I think that's brilliant because for me, the young person is central.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with a woman whose niece decided in high school that she was homosexual. And it was a real embarrassment for the family. And it struck me when those words were described to me. They had to endure that all the while she was in high school. And I went back to that same woman. Admittedly, it took a while for me to go back to her, but I went back to her and said, hang on, why was it an embarrassment for you? The girl is central. That's who we need to focus on, the person who's going through the process, because it must have been absolutely terrifying, scary, isolating, thinking that I'm going through this, I'm not loved, my family don't support me. And I think it's important for me to point out that supporting someone and loving them is totally different from condoning activity. It doesn't mean giving up your values and beliefs, but it's understanding that this is an individual. They're in a place and they need to feel that support and love and work with them. And I think if all of this wonderful advice that you've given, if we look to that as parents and guardians and youth workers and members of the church and so forth and so on, if we just focus on each individual and working with the individual, I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah. I think the sadness for me is recognising that for many of the young people through the years who I have worked closely with, loved, supported, the key issue that seems to see them rejecting faith, rejecting Jesus, is an issue of sex. And I think if we look at Christ, the message of grace is so powerful that, as you say, irrespective of where our church lands theologically, I think we absolutely need to extend the message of grace and love and hope to young people who feel that the things they feel puts them outside of God's love and God's grace. That's an absolute lie, isn't it? None of us are counted out of God's love and grace.
So, Rachel, this has been fantastic. We've come to the end now. I didn't even have to ask some questions because you answered them without me asking. I think that's fantastic. But what key messages do you want to leave with teenage girls on this critical topic of sex that has so many implications for their present? It certainly does for their future, but many times I think one of the reasons that I wanted to do this podcast now for teenage girls is that oftentimes we talk so much about the future. What's going to happen when you're a woman? If you do this, you're not going to succeed as an adult. I'm talking about their lives now. I want you to give them some advice on key messages that you want to leave with them, not only for the future, but also for the present.
So one is quite a practical thing, Sonja. I think a lot of teenage girls, particularly teenage girls in religious communities, internalise a bit of a self-loathing about their bodies. They're a bit afraid of what they feel. They're a bit afraid of their bodies because they don't want to do the wrong things. So I would say to teenage girls, find ways to love your body. Love the fact that God's created you sexual. You have thoughts and you have questions and you have urges. So when you have thoughts and questions, find someone to talk to. Don't repress it. Don't hide it. Don't lock it all deep inside and think that being a good girl is about never thinking about sex or never wanting to have sex. No, you are a good girl because God made you good. You've got body and heart and mind, desire and passions. That's good. And I think if you lock yourself away and try to cope on your own, you will find this is too overwhelming to deal with, and you might end up doing something that you regret, and then you feel the shame, and it begins this cycle. So celebrate yourself, love the body that God gave you, find a few safe people around you who you can talk to if you need to about masturbation, about the stuff that you're involved with, about the relationships that you want to have, about the guy that you fancy who never notices you, all that stuff. That is worth talking about. Don't belittle any of this. And also the other thing I would say is reach out to other girls. Reach out to other women, encourage them. Don't be a girl that judges other girls for decisions they make. Seek the best in the other girl. And the more that we do that to each other, the more that reflects back to us that we are safe to be the girls that God made us to be. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to pick ourselves up. We're going to experience God's grace, and we're going to move on. And wow, what a future we can create with a whole bunch of women who choose to live free, wild, and generous lives.
That's fantastic, Rachel. I should be signing off, but I do have to ask you one more question that I think I missed. Is there anything that you want to tell us about the Romance Academy?
Oh, lovely. Well, it's a project that began about 10 years ago with a documentary series on the BBC called No Sex Please We're Teenagers. And it was just an experiment to see if in a very sexualised culture, if there's any benefit to not being sexually active for a period of time. And the 12 teenagers, not Christians, any of them, really found immense benefit. So I would sort of want to say, if you want to get involved with our project, if you want to use our material with your young people, if you want to kind of create an experiential space where you say to young people, stop, think, just be yourself, explore other aspects of who you are, then come find us. We're part of the Youthscape project, so youthscape.co.uk, and we would love to resource you in these conversations.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel, for being our guest on this really complex subject, but I feel like it's certainly more clear for me. And I think a lot of young people are going to get so much out of it. It's been a fantastic interview, and thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, bless you.
What an exciting, informative, and inspirational special edition of UIO. I'm feeling hopeful and hope you are too, wherever you are in your journey, just starting out as a teenager or more experienced. And as always, thank you for listening, and I must thank God for the opportunity to do the show. My prayer today is that girls will learn more about themselves through dating, build better, more meaningful relationships for healthier, happier living, and that more teenagers will challenge the notion that dating is incomplete without sex. Also, I pray for the protection of girls and that inroads will be made into the fight against oppression, and that girls will find pride and peace in being girls, regardless of sexuality, and that all teenagers struggling with transgender issues will find peace too. I ask these many blessings in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Do feel free to get in touch with Rachel or Youthscope and get in touch here at UIO for more discussion on the subject. Hit me up on Instagram at Sonja D. Lewis, Twitter at Sonja Lewis. Follow the UIO blog on thisandthat.co.uk/UIO-podcast. Email me on info@sonjalewis.com. Let's keep this important conversation going. Take care of you inside out, and remember, it is UIO.